The new footman arrived at Wexcombe Hall on the last grey morning of October, and by noon the whole servants' hall had decided he did not know how to hold a tray. And he carried the breakfast things too carefully, as though the china might turn on him. He set a cup down and waited, quite still, for someone to tell him what came next. The under-butler watched him with a curled lip and named him, in a low voice meant to be overheard, a man not born to service. Charlotte Hale heard the phrase from the schoolroom passage and did not think much of it. She had a lesson to give, and a small boy who would not settle, and the opinions of the hall were not her concern. She passed the man in the corridor an hour later, though, and he lifted his eyes to hers, and she looked back at him without dropping her gaze, because she had never learned the trick of looking away from a person as though he were furniture. What she did not yet know was that the man in the plain coat had a reason for carrying the tray so carefully, and that the reason would unhouse every certainty in that great cold building before the first snow fell. She was 26, and she had been the governess at Wexcombe for 3 years. Before that there had been a father, a country parsonage, a shelf of books read to their spines, and a small competence that a bad harvest and a worse investment had taken from them both in the same wet spring. Her father had died, owing money he had never meant to owe. And Charlotte had gone into service the way a swimmer goes into cold water all at once, because there was no gentler way to do it. She taught the young master of the house his letters and his sums, and, when the weather allowed, the names of the trees along the South Avenue. His name was Thomas. He was 7 years old, and he was the only person at Wexcombe who looked at her as though she were entirely real. The house belonged, in the practical sense, to a woman who was not its owner. Lady Margaret Ashworth was the widow of the late Viscount Wexcombe's younger brother, and she had installed herself at the Hall after the old Viscount died, on the strength of being the nearest relation willing to manage it. She managed it as a general manages a siege. The estate awaited its true master, a young Viscount, who had been abroad these several years, and whom no one at Wexcombe had seen since he was a boy. Lady Margaret spoke of his return often and warmly, and always in a way that suggested the house had been improved in his absence, and that the improver deserved to be remembered when he came. Charlotte had learned to read the woman the way she read the sky before a walk. There was weather in Lady Margaret, and it was rarely fair. If you have ever been the one person in a full room who is not seen, you will know the particular quality of Charlotte's days, and I hope you will stay with her, because she is about to be seen by exactly the wrong person, in exactly the right way. Now let me tell you how the footman came to be carrying that tray. He had been given the name Mr. Reed at the door, and no history to go with it, which was itself unusual. Servants came with characters, written by former employers, folded and creased and honest or dishonest as the case might be. Mr. Reed came with a single letter that Lady Margaret had read twice, and then locked in her writing desk, and after reading it, she had given him the lowest place in the hall and the coldest room above the stables, and had watched him for the first week with an attention that Charlotte found strange. He was perhaps 32. He was tall, and he held himself too straight for a servant, with the kind of posture that is trained into a boy by tutors and riding masters, and cannot be trained out again by any amount of tray carrying. His hands were wrong. They were not the hands of a man who had blacked boots. Charlotte noticed this over the first several days the way one notices a wrong note in a familiar tune, without being able to say at once what the note should have been. He was clumsy at the work, and the Hall was cruel about it, in the small way servants have. The housekeeper, Mrs. Bellamy, called him slow. The under-butler called him worse. And once at the long deal table where the servants took their supper, a scullery maid asked him plainly where he had served before, and Mr. Deming, Pallowy, "'Tis," and Reed set down his spoon and said, after a pause that went on a beat too long, that he had been abroad. It was not an answer. The hall laughed at it, and he took the laughter with a stillness that was not shame. Charlotte, at the far end of the table with the children's supper on a tray, watched him take it, and thought that a man who has truly been beaten by the world does not sit so straight beneath a joke. She thought it and put it away, because it was not her business, and because the last time she had made a person her business, she had lost her father's house. The boy, though, took to him. That was the beginning of it. Thomas, who was frightened of the grooms and bored by the footmen, and who had learned already to make himself small when Lady Margaret entered a room, followed Mr. Reed about the lower passages as though the man were a large, friendly dog. He asked him questions. Mr. Reed answered them. Charlotte, coming to collect the child, would find the two of them crouched over some small thing, a beetle on the flagstones, a knot in a length of twine, and Mr. Fye. Reed explaining it in a low, even voice, with more patience than the work he was paid for ever received. Once she found them at the harness room door, and Mr. Paston. Reed was showing the boy how to coil a rope so it would not tangle, his long, wrong hands moving with an ease that his tray-carrying never had. He looked up and saw her watching, and for the second time he did not look away, and she felt the look go through her like the first cold of a room after the fire has died. She should have taken the child and gone. Instead, she said, because she could not help herself, that he coiled a rope like a man who had been to sea. Mr. Prober. Reed looked at her a moment longer than was proper for a servant to look at a governess, and said that he had been on a great many ships. Then he said her name, which he should not have known, and which no one at Wexcombe used, because to the house she was simply the governess. He said Miss Hale, and the two syllables in his low, even voice were the most startling thing that had happened to her in 3 years. The first frost came, and with it the news that the young Viscount would arrive within the fortnight. Lady Margaret announced it at the family breakfast, to which Charlotte was summoned only because the boy could not yet be trusted at a table without her. The whole house changed shape around the news. Rooms that had been shut were opened. The best linen came out of the presses. Lady Margaret walked the state apartments with the housekeeper and found fault with everything, and the fault-finding had a brightness to it, an appetite, that Charlotte had not seen in her before. To the household, the coming Viscount was a weather front. To Lady Margaret, Charlotte began to understand. He was a prize she had been polishing for years, and now meant to claim. For Lady Margaret had a daughter. Miss Arabella Ashworth was 19, and she had spent the autumn at Wexcombe being fitted for gowns she did not need in the country, and Charlotte had not understood the gowns until now. Arabella was to be presented to the young Viscount as the natural mistress of the hall the moment he crossed the threshold. She was pretty in the way of a well-kept garden, everything in its place and nothing growing wild, and she had been raised to believe that a place had been reserved for her at the head of the table, and that she had only to walk to it. She was not unkind. She simply did not see people who were not part of the arrangement, and Charlotte was not part of the arrangement. And so Arabella looked through her a dozen times a day without malice and without notice. In the week before the Viscount's expected arrival, Charlotte came upon a scene in the lower passage that she was not meant to see. Lady Margaret had Mr. Grend Reed backed against the wall by the still-room door, and she was speaking to him very low and very fast, and her face had the weather in it that Charlotte most feared. Charlotte stopped in the shadow of the stair. She heard Lady Margaret say that he was to keep to the yards and the stables and the lower offices, that he was on no account to be seen above stairs, and that if he forgot himself again she would turn him out onto the road that same hour, letter or no letter. Mr. Reed said nothing at all. He stood against the wall with his straight wrong posture and let the words break over him. And when Lady Margaret had finished and swept away, he stayed a moment with his eyes closed, and Charlotte saw on his face something she had no name for, something that was not a servant's fear. It was closer to grief. She went up the stairs without being seen, and she lay awake that night wondering what a footman could have done to earn a locked letter, and a threat, and a look like that. The Viscount did not come on the appointed day, nor the next. A letter arrived instead, in a hand Lady Margaret did not recognize, saying that his lordship had been delayed upon the road and would send word. The house held its polished breath. Arabella wore one of the new gowns to dinner for no one, and grew fretful. And in the schoolroom, in those suspended days, something quietly took root that Charlotte would not have permitted had she seen it coming. Mr. Reed began to appear at the schoolroom door. He came on the excuse of the boy at first, Thomas had asked him to see the map of the world that hung above the writing desk, and Mr. Reed came to see it, and stayed to look at it far longer than a footman had cause to. He put a finger to a scatter of islands in a warm, far sea, and said he had been there, and told the boy a thing about the birds that lived on them, and the boy was rapt, and Charlotte, pretending to mend a pen, listened to every word. After that, he came most afternoons, in the half hour when the hall did not miss him, and stood at the door with his hands behind his back, and talked with a child about the countries on the map, and Charlotte let him, and told herself it was for Thomas. It was not only for Thomas, though. The third such afternoon he asked her quite directly how a clergyman's daughter came to be teaching Latin to a Wexcombe boy, and she found herself telling him about her father, about the parsonage and the books and the bad spring, more than she had told anyone in 3 years. He listened the way he did everything, now that she watched for it with a stillness that gave the speaker room. When she finished, he was quiet a while, and then he said that her father had done her no wrong in teaching her Latin, whatever the world made of an educated woman in service, and that a mind was not a thing that could be taken by a bad harvest. It was the first time in 3 years that anyone had suggested her learning was not a burden she carried, but a thing she owned. She had to turn to the window so that he would not see her face. I told you she was about to be seen. Here's the first of it. If her quiet has found you across all these years and miles, you might tell her so in a word below, and then come back, for the house is about to turn on its hinge. The next morning, she witnessed the thing that changed everything, though she did not understand what she was witnessing until much later. She had risen early to walk the frost off her thoughts, and she went out by the yard door into the cold blue dark before the grooms were up, and she saw Mr. Reed at the far end of the stable court, and he was not carrying anything, and he was not doing any servant's work. He was standing before the old range of stalls with his hat off, looking up at the coat of arms carved above the arch, the arms of the house of Wexcombe cut in the grey stone 100 years before. He stood before it, the way a man stands before a grave. Then he lifted his hand and touched the lowest edge of the carving, where a boy might once have reached it. And Charlotte understood, in a single cold rush, the thing the locked letter meant, and the thing his hands meant, and the thing his posture meant, and she stepped back into the doorway with her heart going hard in her throat. He was no footman. He was the Viscount. She did not sleep that night for turning it over. The man carrying trays and taking the hall's laughter and coiling rope for a lonely boy was the master of Wexcombe, come home in a servant's coat to see his own house without its company face, and Lady Margaret knew. The locked letter, the threat, the order to keep to the yards, all of it was the woman keeping the true master penned in the stables until she had staged the arrival she wanted, the polished daughter at the head of the room, the whole scene arranged so that his lordship should meet Wexcombe as she had dressed it, and not as it truly was. Charlotte lay in the dark, and understood that she was the only soul in the house who had looked the man in the eye, and seen a man, and that this was either the safest or the most dangerous thing she had ever done. The danger declared itself within the week. Whatever Lady Margaret suspected of the schoolroom afternoons, she moved to end them. She summoned Charlotte to the morning room, and told her in the polished voice that wounded while remaining perfectly correct, that a governess who forgot her place did the child no service, that there had been talk below stairs of Miss Hale's forwardness with a footman, and that talk of that kind attached itself to a woman and did not wash off. She said the word forwardness, the way one sets down a stone. She said that the young Viscount was expected any day, that the house must be above reproach, and that a governess with a stain upon her would find no second household to take her in. It was not a reprimand. It was a leash drawn tight, and Charlotte felt the whole precariousness of her life in it, the 3 years of careful invisibility that one whisper could undo. She said, "Yes, my lady," and went back to the schoolroom, and did not weep until the door was shut. She meant to obey. She told herself she would not look at him again, that she would keep the child to his lessons and the man to his corridor, and let the house arrange itself as it wished. And she kept to it for 2 days. On the third, A raw, wet afternoon with the rain coming sideways off the park, she took Thomas down to the library to find a book of maps he had asked for. And Mr. Reed was there. He had no business in the library. He was standing at the tall windows with a book open in his hands, one of the old estate volumes, and he was not reading it, he was holding it the way she had seen him touch the carved arms in the yard. And when they came in, he turned and the three of them stood in the gray light with the rain against the glass. Thomas ran to the map shelf. Charlotte stayed by the door. "Mr." Reed looked at her across the length of the room and said, low, that she had been avoiding the schoolroom afternoons, and she said that she had her place to keep, and he said, still lower, that he knew what place she had been threatened with, and that it was not right. She should have said nothing. She said instead that a man in his position could hardly speak of what was right for a governess, and she saw the word position land in him, saw him understand that she had said it deliberately, that she knew. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The rain filled the silence. Then he crossed the room, not the whole way, only to the near side of the great table, and set the estate volume down upon it, and said her name again, Miss Hale, and told her the truth in 5 plain sentences, that he was Julian Wexcombe, that he had come home in a servant's coat because he had learned abroad that his aunt had been managing his inheritance in ways he did not trust, that he had wished to see his own house honestly for once before he was Viscount to it, and that he had not expected, in the whole Cole building, to be looked at by anyone as though he were a person. He said that last part, looking directly at her, and the rain came down, and the boy at the far shelf turned a page. She should have curtsied and gone. She did not. She was aware of the small distance of the table between them, of the cold of the room, of her own breath, of the exact place in the air where his hand rested on the leather cover. She said that she had thought him no footman since the first week, that his hands had told her, and something in his face eased at that, some long-held guard coming down by a fraction, and she understood that she had given him a thing he had not had in years, which was to be known, and not for his title. Neither of them said. The other thing. It stood in the room with them, unnamed, the way the truest things do at first. Then Thomas found his book and came running, and the moment closed over like water. And she took the child and went, and her hands were not steady on the schoolroom stair. After that, there was no unknowing it, and no undoing what the knowing did to the ordinary hours. She was aware of him now in a new way, aware of where he was in the house without being told, aware of the sound of his step in the lower passage, aware of the particular quiet that came into a room he had just left. He did not come to the schoolroom again, keeping to the promise the threat had extracted from her as though it bound him too. But they met, as people in a great house always meet, on stairs and in doorways, and once in the walled garden where she had gone to cut the last of the rosemary. He did not speak of his title again, nor she of the threat. They spoke of small things, the boy's progress, a book, the coming of the snow. Under the small things, though, ran the other thing, and once, handing her a fallen sprig of the rosemary she had dropped, his fingers stayed against her gloved palm, a breath longer than the giving required, and she felt the warmth of it through the wool, and neither of them moved. And the failing light went on failing around them, until the moment could not be held any longer, and they parted without a word. I promised you the body knows, before the mind will allow it. Hers knew, standing in that garden with a sprig of rosemary, and a man's fingers gone from her palm, exactly where the story wished to go. Her mind was some way behind, and had a great deal of reasons. For she knew what he did not yet seem to weigh, that she was a clergyman's ruined daughter, in a borrowed room, and he was the Viscount Wexcombe, with an estate and a name, and an aunt who had spent years arranging a wife for him. Whatever passed in a walled garden could not survive a drawing-room. She was not a girl. She had no illusions about what the world did with a governess who let herself be warmed by a lord. It ruined her, and it cost him nothing. And she had seen the pattern often enough in the novels the housekeeper read aloud to think it a truth. And so she did the only thing her 3 years of care had taught her to do. She drew back. She kept to the schoolroom. When they met, she was correct and brief. and she watched with a steadiness that cost her more than she let show, as the day came that Lady Margaret had been building toward all along. He revealed himself to the house on a Thursday. He simply appeared at dinner in his own clothes, a plain dark coat and a white cravat, and took the chair at the head of the long table that had stood empty all these weeks, and the house rearranged itself around the fact of him in the space of a single gasp. Lady Margaret's face, when she came in and found him seated there, was a study Charlotte would not forget. The swift flare of shock, the swifter mastery of it, and then the bright warm welcome laid over the top like fresh snow over a rut. She recovered in a breath and made it a triumph, her nephew home at last, and drew Arabella forward in her best gown. And Julian Wexcombe rose and bowed over the girl's hand with a courtesy so exact it gave nothing away. Charlotte watched from the schoolroom stair, where she had brought the boy to make his bow to his cousin. And she watched the Viscount be a Viscount, and she thought that she had been a fool in a garden. And she took the child upstairs and put the walled garden away in the drawer, where she kept the parsonage and her father's voice and all the other things that were finished. The weeks that followed were an education. Lady Margaret staged a courtship the way she staged everything, with an appetite and a will. There were dinners, and a small assembly of the neighboring families, and Arabella at the Viscount's side at every one of them, presented and represented until the country had it settled between them. Charlotte saw little of it directly, and heard all of it below stairs, where the match was discussed as a thing decided. She kept to her schoolroom. She taught the boy, and if she was aware, always, of exactly where in the great house the Viscount was, she gave no sign of it. And if he sought her once or twice on the stairs with a look she would not meet, she did not let herself read the look, because a look could not be afforded now. The mind had finally caught the body, and the mind had ruled against hope. Then came the night of the assembly, the largest gathering Wexcombe had held in years, and the night the house's verdict on Charlotte was spoken aloud in a room full of light. She had no place at the assembly, and wanted none. The boy, though, woke late and frightened by the noise and the strange carriages, and would not settle without her. And so near midnight she carried him down the back way to see the lights from the gallery. A small kindness she thought no one would mark. She was wrong. Coming back along the corridor that skirted the great saloon, she met Lady Margaret and two of the visiting ladies, and Lady Margaret, warm with wine and triumph in the near certainty of her arrangement, stopped and looked at Charlotte in her plain grey gown with the sleeping child on her shoulder, and said to the ladies, and not to her, that this was the governess, and that one heard the strangest things of her, a forward creature who had been over-familiar with the servants and fancied herself above her station, and that it was a pity, for a plainer, quieter woman would have suited the schoolroom better. And she said it as one remarks on the weather. The ladies made the small sounds ladies make, and Charlotte stood in the corridor with the child heavy and warm against her and the light from the saloon falling across the polished floor. And she said nothing, because there was nothing a governess could say, and she felt the old cold close over her, the certainty that the world had looked at her and set her down as less, and that no amount of quiet dignity would ever be enough to lift the verdict. What she did not know, could not know, standing in that corridor with her face composed and her heart going down like a stone, was that the door of the saloon stood open behind Lady Margaret, and that the Viscount Wexcombe was 3 steps inside it, and had heard every word. She carried the boy up and put him to bed and sat a long time in the dark of the schoolroom without a candle. She had reached that night the floor of the thing. She had let herself be warmed, and she had drawn back in time, and it had not mattered, because the world did not need you to do wrong in order to name you as having done it. She thought with a clarity that had no self-pity in it, only exhaustion, that she would ask Mrs. Bellamy in the morning for a character, and would look for another place before Lady Margaret's word could travel and close the doors ahead of her. She thought she had lost, quietly and completely, the way she had lost the parsonage, without a single loud thing happening. She did not weep. She had gone past weeping into the cold, flat country beyond it. And it was there in that country, near 1 in the morning, that she heard a step she knew on the schoolroom stair. He came in without a candle and stood in the doorway. And she rose because one rose for a Viscount. And he said in the dark that she was not to leave Wexcombe. Just that, plainly, the command shape of it that she had learned to hear, the care inside. She said that she thought she must, that her ladyship had made her position untenable. And he said no, that her position was not her ladyship's. To make or unmake, and that he had heard what was said in the corridor, and that not one word of it was true, and that he had known it was not true since the first week. When a governess in a cold house had looked him in the eye, and treated a man in a servant's coat. As a man he crossed the small room. She could see only the shape of him against the gray window. He said that he had spent his whole life being seen for his name, and never once for himself, until he came home in a stranger's coat, and found one person in the whole building, who did not know the name and looked at him anyway. He said that he had gone abroad to escape being a title, and had come home to find he could not escape it, and that the only hours he had been a man and not a Viscount were the hours in her schoolroom with a map and a boy and her voice. Then he said the thing neither of them had said in the garden. He said that he wanted her, not the schoolroom, not the arrangement his aunt had built her, and that he had wanted her since the rosemary, and that he was tired past bearing of being managed into a life he had not chosen. His voice was not level now. It was the first time she had heard it break. She stood in the dark with her back to the cold window and everything in her, leaning toward the shape of him across the room, and she made herself say the true and terrible thing. She said that want was not enough, that she was a ruined clergyman's daughter, with no fortune and no name, and a whisper already attached to her, and that if he chose her, the world would say he had been trapped by a scheming governess, and that it would cost him his good name, and cost her whatever shred of one she had left, and that she would not be the ruin of the one man who had ever seen her. She said it steadily. It was the hardest steady thing she had ever done. And in the silence after it she heard him cross the last of the room, and his hand found hers in the dark, not taking it, only laying his palm against her palm the way he had in the garden with the wool between them, except there was no wool now, and the warmth of his bare hand against her bare hand went up her arm and into her chest and undid, in one plain touch, the whole cold country she had walked out into. He said, low and rough and close, that he had spent years letting other people decide what things would cost him, and that he was done. He said her name once, Charlotte. And he did not kiss her, though they both stood on the edge of it, because he was a man who understood that a thing done in the dark of a schoolroom would give the world exactly the story it wanted, and he would not let the world have her that way. He stepped back. He said that she would see in the morning what he chose, and that she was to trust him until then. And he went, and she sat down in the dark with her hand still warm and did not sleep at all. He chose in daylight, and he chose in the one room where the house's whole verdict had been rendered. And he chose so that every soul who had heard her named a forward creature would hear her named otherwise. There was a breakfast the morning after the assembly, the neighboring families still in the house, the long table full, Arabella in her place near the head, and Lady Margaret presiding in her triumph, the arrangement all but announced. Charlotte was not there. She was in the schoolroom packing the few books that were her own into a small trunk, having risen with the flat resolve of a woman who did not dare believe a thing said in the dark. And it was into the schoolroom that a footman came, a real one, sent up with a message that Miss Hale was wanted in the breakfast room, at once. By his lordship she went down, because one went when one was sent. She did not know what she was walking into. She stood at the door of the bright full room in her plain gray gown with the ink not yet dry on her hands, and every polished face turned to look at her, and Lady Margaret's face began to arrange itself into the cool question of what the governess could possibly want. The Viscount rose from the head of his own table. He came down the length of it, past his aunt, past Arabella, past the visiting families, in the unhurried way of a man who has decided a thing and cannot be hurried out of it, and the room fell silent, watching him come, and he stopped in front of Charlotte Hale where she stood at the door. He took her ink-stained hand in his and said the thing that could not be unsaid. "I mean to marry Miss Hale before all of you." Gladly. The silence held a full breath. Then it broke into the small sounds a room makes when it has been turned over, the intake of air, the cup set down too hard, the chair legs scraping. Lady Margaret came to her feet with the color going out of her face. She said his name, once, in a voice that had lost its polish, and then she said something about the girl's station, about scandal, about what was owed the family, and the words came faster and less ordered than Charlotte had ever heard from her, the whole architecture of her authority buckling in public in real time. The Viscount did not raise his voice to her. He said only, without letting go of Charlotte's hand, that he had come home in a servant's coat to learn how his house was managed and had learned enough that the accounts would be looked into and his aunt's arrangements set aside, and that Miss Hale had shown more honesty in 3 years of a cold schoolroom than the whole of the season's polish, and that he would hear no more said, against her, under his own roof. He said it level and final, and the room heard the master in it, and Lady Margaret, who had ruled Wexcombe on the strength of there being no master present, sat down slowly into her chair as though the strength had gone from under her, because there was a master present now, and she had spent the autumn penning him in her stables. Arabella, to the surprise of everyone, and perhaps most of all her mother, did not weep or fret. She looked at the Viscount and the Governess a long moment, and then she looked at her mother, and something crossed her pretty well-kept face that had not been there before, a first cold clarity about the arrangement she had been raised inside, and had never once been asked to want. She rose and she came around the table, and she did a thing no one had scripted for her. She made a small correct curtsy to Charlotte, the curtsy of one gentlewoman to another, and said quietly that she wished them joy. It was not much. It was hers, though, chosen and not given, and it was the first sign that the verdict of the room was turning. And Charlotte, who had braced herself for a hostile silence, felt the room begin instead to right itself around her, like a boat coming off a rock. The looking into of the accounts took the shape one might expect, and need not detain us long, save to say that the family solicitor, a dry, careful man named Mr. Parrot, who had served the estate since the old Viscount's day, arrived within the week at his lordship's summons and spent 3 days in the muniment room with the ledgers, and emerged to confirm what Julian had suspected on the road home, that Lady Margaret had for years been quietly bending the estate's income toward her own comfort and her daughter's future, in ways that would not survive an honest audit. Nothing was made loud. The Viscount did not want his aunt in the newspapers or the courts, for she was his father's brother's widow and the mother of a girl who had wished them joy. He settled on her a small independence sufficient to a modest household, and he sent her and Arabella to the dower house of a distant property where the income was clean and the society thin, and he did it without cruelty and without apology, and Lady Margaret went because there was nothing left to stay for, her authority ended, her arrangement undone, her long siege lifted by the arrival of the very master she had tried to stage. She was corrected and displaced and made small, and she was not destroyed. And Charlotte, who had every reason to want her destroyed, found that she wanted only this, the woman gone and the house quiet, and the cold weather of her taken out of the rooms. They were married in the parish church at the turn of the year, without a crowd, the way Charlotte wished it, with the boy Thomas standing up beside them in a new coat in a state of solemn joy, and Mr. Parrot as a witness, and the old housekeeper, Mrs. Bellamy, weeping frankly in a front pew and denying it afterward. Charlotte wore a gown of soft gray grain that Julian had asked her to choose, without regard to cost, and she had chosen it plain because plain was who she was, and he had fallen in love with who she was, and she was not going to become someone else at the altar. Her father was not there to give her away. She had carried down from the schoolroom, though, and tucked into the small pocket at her wrist, the one thing of his she had kept through all the selling and the service, a slim worn volume of his own hand-copied verses that she had read to their spines in the parsonage in the years before the bad spring, and at the moment the vicar joined their hands she felt the shape of it against her wrist, her father's hand present in the only way it could be, and she understood that she had not lost the parsonage after all, not the part of it that mattered, which had never been the house. Snow began on the evening of the wedding day, the first true snow of the winter. Soft and steady past the tall windows of the long saloon where the room had once rendered its verdict, and where now a fire was built high against the cold. Julian had sent the last of the guests away, and the servants to their own warm supper, and it was only the three of them in the great warm room, the master of Wexcombe and his wife, and the boy who had been the first at that whole cold house to look at a strange footman and follow him about the passages. Thomas had fallen asleep on the hearthrug with a book of the Far Islands open under his cheek, the very book. And Charlotte sat in the firelight with her father's verses in her lap, and her husband's hand over hers on the arm of the chair. And outside the snow came down and covered the stable court and the carved arms above the arch, and the whole managed acreage of the estate, in a clean silence that asked nothing of anyone. She thought of the morning he had arrived, carrying the tray too carefully, and of how the whole hall had decided he did not belong, and of how she had passed him in the corridor and looked him in the eye, because she had never learned to look away from a person as though he were furniture. She thought that the smallest thing she had ever done, refusing to unsee a man, had been the thing that undid every certainty in the cold building and remade her life. Julian's thumb moved once across the back of her hand, and she turned from the window to find him watching her in the firelight. Not as a viscount watches, but as the man in the servant's coat had watched her over a coiled rope in the harness room, before either of them had a name for it. Neither of them spoke. The fire settled, the boy slept, and the snow went on falling past the glass, filling the yard where a man had once stood bareheaded before his own name, until the whole of Wexcombe was quiet and white, and for the first time in a long, cold while, at home to those who lived in it. If Charlotte's long invisible years and the morning she was finally seen have stayed with you, I hope you will sit a moment longer in the firelight with her before you go, and if you are so moved, leave a word below about the moment that found you. Thank you for staying to the end.